So good morning, everyone. Um, this talk is probably about half an hour, so I'll probably go 5 minutes over just to warn you. We're going to continue our studies in Genesis today with the second part in a 7-part series that I've planned for chapters 1, 2, and 3 of this fascinating book. The title that I've just given to the little series is God's Perfect Planet, the Blueprint for Life in Our Universe. And as I mentioned in the introduction to my first talk, the purpose of these studies is to try and consider what the author of Genesis was trying to communicate to ancient Israel, and then what that communicates to us in the church all these years later. And rather than getting bogged down by some of the popular debates that surround these texts, I'm going to try and avoid those and pay more attention to what we actually see in these texts and what it teaches us about God, about the world we live in, and about the kind of people that we are. And these wonderful, rich, intriguing, and yet sometimes confusing chapters have much to teach us about the reality of the world we live in today. This book, in many ways, is God's own commentary on God's own world. And so, as we spend time in Genesis, I think we should expect to learn many insights into how our universe really operates. So just to give you a bit of a reminder of what we did last time. The last time we were together, I introduced the book and explored what the author tells us about God's activity in our world in the first 3 days of creation under the title Created Order. And in that study, we saw that this whole story is intended to tell us about God's activity to bring fruitful, life-giving order to his creation. And sure enough, as we spend time in the text, that's exactly what we see happening as God works to establish order in an initially disordered, dark, and lifeless world. Into the darkness of verse 2, God speaks, and as he does so, he forms 3 ordered domains that each play a significant role in making life on earth possible. The domain of cyclical light, the domain of the waters, and the domain of dry, stable, life-giving land. Through the display of God's ordering power in these 3 days, he shapes the world so that it is now ready for him to move on to the next significant stage in his plan for the world, the filling of these 3 realms with fitting rulers. And that is the title for our studies today, Fitting Rulers. This seems to me to be the main point that the author of Genesis is communicating through days 4, 5, and 6 of this first creation narrative. And so as we work our way through this section, we will see how God takes the 3 ordered realms that he established on days 1, 2, and 3, and then fills each of them with rulers that he has suited to make use of each specific order that he established in each realm. Let's now read then from Genesis 1, and I'll begin at verse 1, and then we'll skip a few verses down to where the discussion of days 4 to 6 begins. And once again, I'm going to be reading from the Lexham English Bible, because it's the one I use while I'm studying. So in verse 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." And then we have the recounting of days 1 to 3, and go down to verse 14 then, and we start in verse 4. "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give life upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly across the earth, or fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that lives on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast on the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So just like last time, I'm going to work through the rest of this talk in three main steps. First, I want to explain why I think this section is summarized by the theme fitting rulers. Second, we will look at the specific things said about each of these fitting rulers that are set over the realms of creation. And finally, I want to call you to the two same responses that I called you to last time, in light of what we learn about God and about our world in these verses. So that's the plan. Let's get into the first stage of my talk. Why do I use the title Fitting Rulers to summarize this section? Well, as I mentioned last time, the 6 days of creation are presented as two sets of three. The first set of three presents God's activity in establishing three ordered realms within creation. And then the second set of 3 days revisits these three realms in the exact same order, even replicating the two-part structure of what happens on day 3. I'm going to visualize this in a chart with some images that I borrowed from the Bible Project. As you can see on the left, we have the ordered spheres on day 1, 2, and 3. And in these days, God forms the realm of cyclical light, the realm of the waters above and below, and the realm of dry, fertile land. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we now revisit each of these ordered spheres in turn, this time being told about certain entities that are placed into these realms. But if you look at the text, you will notice that these entities are not simply placed within the realms with nothing to do. Rather, they are each given specific tasks related to ruling over the realm that they have been placed within. To put it another way, each of these entities fulfills a number of specific purposes within the realm that God has placed them into. And when each of these fitting rulers follows the calling that God gives to them, the world is transformed into a realm of even greater order and blessing from God, a realm of life. We'll examine the rulers and their calling in detail in just a moment, but for now let me summarize what happens on these 3 days. First, on day 4, the lights of the sky are called to rule over the day and night. Second, on day 5, the fish are called to rule over the seas, and the birds are called to rule over the air. And third, on day 6, the animals are called to rule over dry land. And finally, at the conclusion of the sequence, humans are called to operate as God's special rulers. They are uniquely elected to be God's imagers on the earth and delegated to exercise God's authority as his representatives within his world. So I hope you can see then with this little survey that the main theme the author wants to communicate in the second set of 3 days is the significance of fitting rulers that God has placed over each of the 3 ordered realms that he formed on days 1 to 3. It's time now to move on to the second stage of my talk. We will take each day one at a time and pay attention to what the text tells us about two main things. First, we will note the rulers that God sets over each sphere of creation. And second, we will examine the specific role given to those rulers by God. Let's start with day 4. Day 4 is described for us in verses 16 to 18. And here we are told that God makes two great lights in the sky and then some other lesser lights alongside these main lights. The lights are each given specific roles. The greater light is tasked with ruling over the day, and the lesser light is tasked with ruling over the night. So what do we learn about these lights? Well, first we see that they fill the ordered realm that God created on day 1. On day 1, God ordered the realm of light and darkness, calling the period of light day and the period of darkness night. And if you remember from our studies last time, it seems that the splitting of the light and darkness is intended to communicate the direct presence of God, arriving into this dark, chaotic world and establishing a rhythm of light and time that makes creation of life on the later days of creation possible. And now in day 4, God chooses to pass the task of splitting night and darkness to these lights that he creates on day 4. And sure enough, those lights choose to obey him. Today we call these lights the sun, the moon, and the stars. And ever since the formation of these lights in the beginning, they have constantly and consistently carried out the role that God gave to them. And this stability among the sun, moon, and the stars caused an interesting phenomenon in the ancient world. The writer of Genesis seems to be possibly indirectly addressing this phenomenon in this story. The sun, moon, and stars have such a significant role in human life that many cultures and religions have claimed that they are gods who rule over us. Many of the people groups who lived around the ancient Israelites believed that the sun and the moon were celestial deities who produced life and should be worshipped because of their utter, unquestionable power. While the other gods that these people worshipped, such as the weather god and the god of thunder or the crop god, were all volatile and easily angered, the sun god and the moon god were considered to be different because they were consistent. They did what they did every day, never changing year on year, and so the people thought of them as uniquely powerful, as the most powerful gods in many cultures. However, the first creation story in Genesis tells us right from the very outset that God, who revealed himself to Israel, is himself the source of the sun and the moon and the stars. Rather than being powerful gods in and of themselves, these lights are simple servants of the one true God. They obey him without question. He placed them where they are to do what he wanted them to do, and so it is he that humanity should worship, and it is to him that we should offer up thanks, not to them in and of themselves. As we are introduced to the God who created the sun, moon, and stars, we come face to face then with a God of undeniable power and wisdom. But that's not all. We learn from this passage that the sun, moon, and stars are rulers that God has called to carry out specific tasks. And what are those tasks? Well, we see 3 specific roles God has given to the sun, moon, and stars outlined for us in verse 16. And as we look at them, we will see that God gives these lights, these roles, so that they can serve the other rulers that he will set over the other spheres on days 5 and 6. The first role given to them is this: the lights are to separate day from night. The establishment of the pattern of day and night is now ruled by the sun and the moon. And unless, as some of us do, we work night shifts, this is the exact same pattern that we humans follow even until today. It is actually scientifically proven that our bodies are wired to wake up when the sun marks the beginning of the day and to begin to fall asleep as the moon rises to rule over the night. And it's actually the case that if it weren't for all of the unnatural light that we fill our homes and streets with, we would all more naturally follow this rhythm. And for those of us who live so far north on the earth, that would probably mean sleeping a whole bunch more during the winter and being awake for an awfully long time during the summer. But that's a little bit beside the point. The second function the sun, moon, and stars are given in verse 16 is to serve as markers for significant events, helping people measure the progression of days and years. With the widespread technology that we have in our modern world of digital clocks and scientifically accurate calendars, we often forget that without the rhythm of the sun and the moon, there is actually no way to measure what time it is during the day or how many days are passing. And likewise, without the rhythm of the stars, there is no way for humans to measure the passing of years or to tell what stage of the year we are actually at present. And obviously, the rhythm of time and the ability to measure time is vital for all kinds of life. In much the same way as we make constant use of time to organize like a Zoom call later on at 7 p.m. or scheduling the significant birthday party for this time next year. The ancient people also needed to track what time it was in order to live. If you want to decide whether or not it was the right time of the day to head for the watering hole, you need the sun to tell you what time it is. Or if you wonder whether it's the right part of the year to plant crops so that they'll actually grow, you need the rhythm of the moon and the position of the stars to tell you that. We see then that measuring all of this is actually a vital part of life on Earth. And all of it is dependent upon the daily pattern of the sun and the moon and the yearly pattern of the stars as they together obey God's calling to rule over the domain of cyclical light and darkness. The third thing that verse 16 tells us is that the sun and moon are ordered to produce light and to bathe the earth with it. I don't have time now to focus on this one, and I already covered much of the importance of light in my first talk. So I'll just note that we all recognize how vital life is to every how vital light is to every part of life on our earth even today. In summary then, what happens on day 4 is this. The ordered realm of day 1 is filled with lights, and these lights are set by God as rulers over this realm, tasked with separating day from night, providing information about days and years, and bathing our world in light. Let's move on to day 5, which is outlined for us in verses 20 to 23. What are we told about this day? Well, in day 5, we are told that God fills the ordered watery realms that he created on day 2 with rulers that he has especially fit for each realm. The waters below are filled with swarms of sea creatures, and the sky above is filled with birds. And just like we saw on day 4, these creatures are then given a specific calling. This calling is described fairly generally in the text, but it actually still has wide-reaching consequences that we continue to benefit from today. What are these creatures called to do? Well, we see in the text that the sea creatures and the birds are called to rule over the realms that they have been placed within by carrying out 2 related tasks. First, they are called by God to be fruitful and multiply. And this phrase means more than, or basically means to produce more of yourself. But it doesn't just mean having lots of baby chicks or spawning lots of fish eggs. The idea has more significance than just that. In the text, this role is expressed alongside the language of blessing. And therefore, we see that it also includes the idea of God tasking these creatures with dispensing his goodness to the earth as they produce more of themselves. And as these creatures submit to God by producing more of themselves, they also have a second calling to fulfill. This second calling he has given them is this. He tells them to fill the realms over which they have been placed. For the sea creatures, this means filling the sea with more sea creatures. And for the birds, this means filling the sky with more birds. The text therefore tells us that it is a good thing for there to be a multitude of life in the seas and in the skies. For through this multitude of life that God has created, he will bring his blessing upon the earth. And you might get the hint from these talks that I like David Attenborough. And if you get that hint, you'd be right. Because I find his documentaries to be massively helpful in letting me see for myself the wonders of God's wisdom in setting rulers over the sea and the sky to multiply and to fill those realms. When we learn about sea cucumbers and shrimp and salmon and sharks and the whole life cycle within the oceans around us, and see how this proliferation of life within our oceans maintains and supports everything from the temperature of the earth to the production of oxygen for us to breathe, to the production of ingredients that are used today in medicines, we see the wisdom of our God in filling the sea with aquatic life. And we learn, when we go then learn about blue tits and barn owls and blackbirds and bats, we see how this proliferation of life in the skies maintains and supports everything in our world, from the scattering of seed that prompts the growth of trees, to the pollination of plants, to the very idea of flight that we have harnessed to build airplanes, to the songs that we enjoy if we live in the countryside as we wake up each morning. We see the wisdom of our God in filling the skies with bird life. And so to summarize what happens on day 5, we see the filling of 2 ordered realms that were formed on day 2 with rulers who were fit to live within them, sea creatures and birds that are tasked with reproducing themselves and filling the earth with God's blessing. Let's move on then to day 6. And this is the final day in creation, the creation sequence. And in many ways, it's the most significant. Without the previous days, this day wouldn't have been possible though. And so all of the days are significant in their own right. We read about day 6 in verses 24 to 31. And as I already mentioned, there are 2 parts to day 6, just like there were 2 parts to day 3. In the first half of day 6, we have the creation of various land animals. So what do we learn about these animals? Well, these animals are created to fill the realm that God ordered on day 3. On day 3, God formed dry, fertile land, and now he fills that land with animals suited to that domain. The text describes for us the creation of 3 types of land animal that are suited to dwell on the dry land that God has formed. Now, identifying exactly what groups are being referred to here is a little difficult because ancient people grouped animals by different means than we do. And so modern people tend to try and make these categories equal to categories that we use today. When we want to group animals, we use complex descriptions and classifications and species and genetics and all the rest. But for the ancient people, animals were basically split into categories that corresponded with where those animals lived and the kind of things that they got up to on a regular basis. So for example, we've already seen that all birds are put in one category, and then all sea creatures in another, and then all the land animals are often placed in yet another category. However, the single label of land animals is far too broad a category most of the time, because not all land animals get up to the same thing on the land. So ancient people gave some extra labels to the land animals that corresponded to what they were used for or what they usually did during their lives. And most of the resources I consulted came up with definitions of the groups that looked something like this. The first group is labeled with the Hebrew word behema, which roughly corresponds to the animals we identify today as domesticated animals. Those are animals such as cattle, sheep, goats, and other herd animals that the people in Israel would have farmed or kept for protection. And the second group is the Hebrew word remez, and it roughly corresponds to small moving creatures that live close to the ground. Animals such as snakes, lizards, turtles, and rodents would fall into this category. And then the third group is the Hebrew word hayah, which roughly corresponds to wild or dangerous animals. And when this word is used elsewhere in the same context as behema, it almost always corresponds to animals such as lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. So that's what we are told about the land animals. But what was their role? Well, not much is directly said within the text about the function that is given to these animals. But I think it's safe enough to assume that the same role is given to these animals as was given to the birds and the sea creatures. If this is the case, then they too are called to be fruitful and to multiply, and they are called to fill the earth. By performing these functions and ruling over the dry land, these animals also extend God's blessing to the earth. As the animals exercise their rule, they cultivate the ground. They keep it from becoming disordered or unkempt. They perform some of the same work as the birds by pollinating plants and maintaining ecosystems. And further, they ensure a constant supply of food for the humans and also an order of being for humans to rule over. But although the land animals are highly significant for the operation of our world, what happens on the second half of day 6 causes the animals to fade into relative insignificance. In the second phase of God's action on day 6, he forms the capstone of his creation and sets it over everything else that he has formed. Enter humans. Now, there's much that is said about humanity in these verses, but I'm going to leave the explanation of humanity's role on the earth until my next talk. So that's just the way it is. So you're going to have to wait until next time, because if I was to try and get into it now, it would be another 20 minutes, and I know I'm already over time. So in order to try and bring this talk to its natural conclusion, I hope that I've showed you the significance of the two halves of the first creation story. In the first half, we have the establishment of 3 ordered realms. And then in the second half, God sets fitting rulers within these realms to serve him by filling these realms with life and carrying his blessing throughout each of them for the benefit of others. So what do we do with this knowledge? Well, like last time, there isn't actually much in what I've said that's directly about us as humans or the kind of people that we should be. Instead, it's telling us much about the kind of God God is and the kind of world that he has placed us within. And so again, I want to simply return to the 2 calls that I gave you last time. I don't know if you've tried out the process that I suggested of tracing something that you've enjoyed in the last month, right back through its origins, and then thought about or meditated on how the ordered creation that God has established has made it possible for you to enjoy that thing. If you did, I'd be interested to know what that was like for you. Did it increase your gratitude or wonder? I think it probably did. And so I'll just leave you with these 2 encouragements again. At some point this week, just take 5 minutes to pause and think about whatever it is before you, your lunch, or the weak winter sun, or your pets, or the plant garden, or the bird feeder, or the field out the back, or whatever it is that's in your life right now. And think about 2 things. First, think about how God's filling of our ordered earth has made it possible for you to enjoy this thing. And then offer up gratitude to him for the wonderful world that he has allowed us to inhabit. And second, let these considerations increase your wonder of the kind of God that God is. He made every single part of this. He ordered it and he filled it without any outside consultation. He made it to put his own wisdom and power on display, and it does that wonderfully. So choose to follow all the rest of creation. For if the stars were made to worship, so will I. Thanks for listening.